It's great to see you. Good morning. Thank you for being here for a Sunday Bible study. We are in 1 Kings 15. I think everybody knows that. We're picking up with 15th chapter today, making progress right along the way in our divided kings and kingdoms in God's nation of Israel. So we're in a point right now where we have all kinds of conflict that's taking place, but not necessarily today, but through this section that we're going to have upcoming, Israel's going to learn a better way. Instead of being at odds all the time, unity. Unity can be a beautiful thing. But for right now, we have problems through which we need to work. I mentioned we're in chapter 15, and of course we're starting in verse 1. Verse 1 says, "In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam became king over Judah." Now, this isn't new information for us. This is bridging the gap. We spent our first class period of this divided section talking about the nation of Israel. Jeroboam, of course, is the leader over the north. How long does Jeroboam reign? And, okay, time out. Great, you're right. Good job, by the way. But you're probably going to get maybe a little bit bored by this, but I need to ask about these time frames, because time frames are going to be significant here. So very good. Justin said Jeroboam reigns for 22 years in the north. We cover that whole section, and then we rewind all the way back to the beginning of Jeroboam's reign, but not for the purpose of talking about Jeroboam. We've already done that. Now we need to catch up with what's been going on in the south. The first ruler in the south is Rehoboam, who is whose son? Good, Solomon's son. Remember, Jeroboam was an advisor in the cabinet, if you will, and he's this this manager over a whole bunch of workers and all the building projects of Solomon. But Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. In fact, strangely enough, he is the only son of Solomon who is mentioned in the Bible. It may have been the only one that he had, or it might just be that God's so disappointed with his marriages. There are other children and daughters that are named of Solomon, but Rehoboam is the only son. Okay, so Rehoboam reigns in the south, and we've covered this for how long? 22 years for Jeroboam in the north. How many years for Rehoboam in the south? Very good, 17 years. So we're still in about 5 years of catch-up in the south that we need to do. And so we're going to continue talking about the southern kingdom for this next class period. Verse 1 of chapter 15, 1 Kings, states, "In the 18th year." Now, based on what's just been brought out, that's significant, not so much in the reign of Jeroboam, but we can use Jeroboam's reign as a gauge for what's going on in the south. That's important because that means a change in kings in the south. Good morning. Welcome in to everybody. We're in 1 Kings 15. Glad to have you. 1 Kings 15. Okay, so in the 18th reign of Jeroboam, during his 22-year reign, there's a new king who's going to be stepping in the southern kingdom of Judah. Abijam became king over Judah. We already learned that at the end of chapter 14. Now, who is Abijam again, relative-wise? M-A-A-H. Very good, very good. We have the mother right there, right? Okay, but yeah, she did. Yeah, absolutely so. Thank you, Roy. So Abijam is the son of the one who reigned before, Rehoboam, right? And of course, we know about the mother and Maacah, wasn't it, or along those lines? Is that right? Anyway, but Abijam is the son of Rehoboam, who is the son of Solomon. So that means Abijam is the grandson of Solomon. Now listen to this. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. Okay, let's go back and trace some other numbers here quickly. The first king over united Israel reigns how many years? Saul. Second king, David. Third king, Solomon. Okay, I know Saul has his major hiccups. He starts out as a servant of the Lord, and by the end it's just a total mess, right? David, great king of God. We're going to be reminded of that today. There's an issue that he experiences, a major issue, but overall, a great servant of the Lord, 40 years. Solomon, I would say overall, wouldn't you, a great servant of the Lord, had probably a longer stretch and bigger messes, but it seems like turns his life around at the end. And then we have Jeroboam, 22 years, Rehoboam, 17 years. The time periods have been cut in half. And why do we know that makes a lot of sense? One of God's promises to his kings is, hey, you follow me, you listen to me, you respect me, I'll bless you. He has the promise of longer life, the promise of longer reigns, and the fact that the ones below them are cut in half would naturally tell us they're not listening to God the same as what they have been. Now you look in verse 2, as we just read, he, that is Abijam, who's the grandson of Solomon, the son of Rehoboam, reigns for 3 years in Jerusalem. That's it. What would that tell you, do you think, about his reign? It's like it's going off a cliff by this point, and we're seeing this continued progress, but not in a good way. Okay, so I want to back up to verse 1 in 1 Kings 15 and point out a couple of things. This is funny. I probably ought to do this a lot more. Every now and then I bring out names and meanings of them. But there was one that caught my attention. I thought, well, I need to look that up. And that was very telling. And then I thought, well, since I'm there and I'm on my resource, I might as well look this. Wow, and this one, you're kidding me. And this one, that's awesome. Anyway, so I hope I don't get lost in this little rabbit trail here. But I want to go back to verse 1. Jeroboam, the meaning of Jeroboam, the people will contend. The people will contend. How fitting. Jeroboam leads essentially a rebellion while he's under united Israel. And then Israel, when she becomes rebellious, says, hey, we want this guy who stands up for the people's rights. And he says, hey, too much taxes. And he stands, the people will contend. The people will rise. That's interesting. Now, Abijam is the one that doesn't seem to fit here. He reigns for 3 years. We're going to find out he's just a complete mess from start to finish, and God doesn't tolerate him for very long. But Abijah's name means Yah, which is a shortened name for God, Yahweh. Yah is my father. Yah is my father. Keep that in mind as we move along right here. Okay, verse number 2. I'd like to point out a couple of names, if you'll allow me. His mother's name, Abijam reigns 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the granddaughter, of Abishalom. Abishalom. You know, you have the shalom, peace, a greeting in Hebrew, and then the Abba is like Abba that we know from Aramaic. Abba means what? Father. Very good. So Abba means father, and Shalom, said the greeting in Hebrew for extensions of peace. Yeah, the name means my father is peace. My father is peace. Maacah means oppression. Oppression. I think you have opposite ideas here. So Maacah means oppression, but she is the granddaughter of Abishalom, which means my father is peace. Now, I think that tells us something about what's changed through the generations. You go a couple of generations up, and what's on people's minds? Their hearts are expressing Abishalom, or peace. My father is peace. That's what's going on underneath the reign of Solomon, right? But you go down a couple of generations, and you have Maacah, oppression, fighting, conflict, constantly. Anyway, I found that interesting, and we're going to bring back in some of the meanings of these names. But going on into verse 3, let's find out a little bit more about Abijam. Abijam, he walked in all the sins of his father. Who's his father? Abijam's father. I know it gets challenging. We're tossing around all these names. Rehoboam, very good. So, Rehoboam is not completely rotten to the core. Things start out pretty well, and we're going to be reminded about that. But he walked in all the sins of his father, did Abijam, which he had done before him. His heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. I ask you to keep your spot in 1 Kings 15. But, if you will, turn over to 2 Chronicles, the 11th chapter. 2 Chronicles 11. I want to be reminded about something concerning this guy, Abijam's father, Rehoboam, and his reign in the southern kingdom that's now been divided in Judah. So, 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 13 and through 16, we've read this a few times about how you have all those who are loyal to the worship of Yahweh, who defect from the northern territory because there's all this idolatrous worship going on, and essentially it's been made illegal to worship the true God of Israel. And so you have all these priests and all these Levites and then just all kinds of other people who want to be true to the Lord, to his worship and his ways, the lifestyle, and they defect and they go to the southern kingdom of Judah. Notice in verse 17 of 2 Chronicles 11, they strengthen the kingdom, all these people who cross over. They strengthened the kingdom in the south, Judah, and for 3 years they made Rehoboam the son of Solomon secure. 4, they walked for 3 years in the way of David and Solomon. But what's being implied about what would take place after 3 years? Not as much as before. They turn and they start doing everything that's being done in the north, or at least a lot of it also. So we go back to 1 Kings 15. We just read in verse 3 that Abijam, who is the son of Rehoboam, walked in all the sins of his father. His dad started out doing really well for 3 years. And then he reigns for a total of 17 years, which means for 14 years, he's a little bit rotten. And his boy remembers more what took place in the inn and what he was taught by dad. And he does all the bad things that dad was doing. His heart's not loyal to God, as was the heart of his father David. Verse 4, nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by setting up his son after him and by establishing Jerusalem. And this is done with David's son directly, of course, in Solomon. And then it's done with David's son and his grandson in Rehoboam. Then it's done with David's son, that is his great-grandson, in Abijam. And so God is kind to this descendancy of kings, and not so much because they deserved it, but because David was such a loyal follower of his. Verse 5, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not turned aside from anything that he commanded him all the days of his life. Now, that's really impressive when you consider how long David reigned. 4 decades, and he remains true to the Lord. Although we are given this one thing as a reminder, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite, and that was a big deal, okay? He did what was wrong there, and it was blockbuster, and it really is no laughing matter at all. Sin and the consequences, and there are so many lives that are lost. David gets involved in murder and deceit and adultery, just all kinds of terrible things. So it's not saying that David was perfect in every way, but let's keep in mind he's a human being. And let's be a little bit careful in jumping on the bash David bandwagon, and just ask yourself about this. Have you consistently, all through your days, done everything that God has ever expected of you? And even for those who have been true to the Lord, consistently, ballpark, overall, at the same time, as you look back, is there one thing, or is there one stretch that was just a real mess to which you could point? Yeah, David had this one big thing. He had this stretch, and it was not beautiful at all. But overall, he has a heart for God. And what makes David unique is that even in his major blunders, when these errors are pointed out to him, not only does he address those things, but you can tell he is ripped apart on the inside. And he returns to God in repentance. He begs for his forgiveness. And that's what makes him the man after God's own heart. A great lesson for us that have done things like David has done, but probably even far worse than what David does, or at least far many more things than what he's done. Joe. Very good, Joe. And it's so tragic, isn't it? It's something that we've seen in this family a number of times already. David and his mistakes, and particularly with the opposite sex. And then we point out about Solomon. Well, Solomon, 1,000 wives and all that. Where do you think he learned that stuff? David didn't do that as much and as often, but he took the lesson that his dad had taught him and he carried it to his logical end. Well, if this would be okay, then it might as well times. And you see these things magnified throughout. The mother, the Ammonites, the land of Canaan that we saw before. It's repeated. Hey, all these things that are going on that aren't real good, well, don't forget who his mom was. All these things going on that are terrible gets worse and worse, and we're told, don't forget who his mom was. He'd learned it in his own family. And as I stated at the end of our last class, the decisions that we make in our families today not only have great weight for us here and now and for our eternities even down the road, but as well for many successive generations that would come down the road. Very good, Joe. Thank you. Verse 6, and there was war between Rehoboam, that's the king in the south, for 17 years, and Jeroboam, the king in the north, in the divided kingdom, for 22 years, all the days of his life. What do you know? You divide a people, and you're not going to be united. That's blockbuster news, right? Well, that's not what we expected. It's common sense. Joe, you reap what you sow. If you reap division, you're going to continue to experience division. Division does not lead to unity. Yes, sir. Yeah, very good, Tim. So Tim mentioned what's going on in the Middle East right now between the Jews and the Arabs. So we are 4,000 years removed from Abraham. And we go back and these seeds of division get sowed. Not God's idea in the beginning. It was a human being's idea. Hey, God's made a promise, but maybe we should go about God's promise this way and fulfilling it, and it creates what we still have 4 millennia later. You sow seeds of division, and you get division. The seeds of division have been sown. The kingdom has split. The government does not listen to her people. It turns out for a mess. And then you have 2 separate governments, and they're just constantly at odds with one another. I would like to look back at chapter 12, if you will. Chapter 12 of where we are in 1 Kings. And don't forget about this. What God's idea was about what it is that's taking place here. 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 21. When Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen warriors. And this is when these initial seeds of division have been sown. And the tribe of Benjamin, to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, the prophet in the south, say to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, king of Judah, and to all the house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, thus says the Lord, you shall not go up or fight against your relatives, the people of Israel. God tells them, no, I don't want any conflict. I don't want any war among you. And the reason for this is simple. You are brothers. Family should not be fighting with family, period. He continues, every man return to his home, for this thing is from me. In other words, this is punishment that I'm bringing on the land. But I don't want you going to war and having this conflict with each other. Credit Rehoboam. So they listened to the word of the Lord, and they went home again according to the word of the Lord. So they listened to God initially, and there's no war. When we get to chapter 15, and we learn in verse 6, there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam all the days of his life, which indicates to us they don't continue listening to God. In the beginning, okay, we won't have our war. And then for the next 17 years, it's nothing but war. They stop listening to the Lord and his advice. But on the other side of things, you reap what you sow. They've sown seeds of division. They don't want to listen to one another. They don't want to coexist. And guess what? There's conflict between the two of them. Verse 7 of our passage. Now the rest of the acts of Abijam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Now keep that in mind, because even though we're using the Kings as our main text, every now and then we'll sprinkle in some Chronicles that'll have additional details, and we'll find those here in a little bit. Verse 8. I need to conclude verse 7. There was war between Abijam and Jeroboam. So that's when the crossover. You have 17 years of Rehoboam, and he fights. There's conflict with Jeroboam all those days. There are 5 more years then at the end of this of Jeroboam's reign. Abijam takes over. And how long does Abijam reign? I know we're jumping names and numbers a lot, but I believe in you. 3 years. Okay. And guess what? It's just 3 more years of war. So there have been 20 years, 2 long decades of civil war going on between the North and the South. We've drawn some parallels, excuse me, with America, and we'll continue to do that as we move forward. Verse 8, so Abijam rested with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. Then, okay, now here's where we're really going to concentrate for the rest of our time. Then Asa, his son, reigned in his place. So we'll get into verse 9, and continuing down through the remainder of our text in 1 Kings today, 15, we're going to see some changes, positive changes, begin to occur in the southern kingdom of God's people, Judah. In the 20th year of Jeroboam, so we're right about our time frame, Jeroboam in the north reigns for 22 years. Southern, comparatively, from the south, 17 of those years are spent in Rehoboam's reign, and then 3 years in Abijam, so 17 plus 3 equals 20. So in the 20th year, there's already the third king who's going to be taking over in Judah, and still the first king is ruling in Israel. Asa becomes king over Judah. This reign's different, though. Verse 10, and he, that is Asa, king of Judah, reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. 41 years in Jerusalem. Time period alone. What might that suggest to you about Asa? He's going back to the length of reign like David and like Solomon, the fathers. What does that suggest to you? Finally, a breath of fresh air. By the way, Asa's name means healer. You have that also? Isn't that interesting? Healer. He's going to heal the wounds, the spiritual wounds of God's people. How fitting. He reigned 41 years in Jerusalem. His grandmother's name was Maacah, same one that's mentioned here, the granddaughter of Abishalom. And going back to verse 2, his mother's name, Abijam, was Maacah. And so you have the successive generation here in verse 10. It's the grandmother's name was Maacah, which means oppression in this time period. But you go back a couple of generations, the granddaughter of Abishalom, and the meaning of Abishalom is, my father is peace. It was a time of peace and unity. But now it's a time of oppression and division. But notice in our memory verse, who would like to say that? Verse 11, it's a short and sweet one, pretty easy to store away. 1 Kings 15:11. Yes, sir. Go right ahead, Roy. So this is beginning to confirm our suspicions. You have this drop-off in length of reign and God's cursing instead of his blessing, and then you find out about this guy. Hey, he reigns for the same time period as the faithful ancestors. And sure enough, we find, well, Asa did what God told him to do. Just like the faithful ancestors who had reigns of like 40 years. And his is even 1 year longer, 41. Go right ahead, Roy. Yeah, maybe a period of weakness. I would agree with you. That would make a lot of sense. I think it's probably going to go back to, though, the expectations of God. And even though it'd be great if we lived perfectly, we all strive for perfection, right? We don't. David didn't. Solomon didn't. Go back. He didn't. She didn't. He didn't. She didn't, right? But I think that's part of it, that it's an overall. Moses didn't? Okay, good. I think overall it's a life of service to the Lord, not of perfection, but of direction. He did. Yeah, he did it. Nothing we can point out there, right? Good, Roy. Joe, did you? Yeah. Sure. Great, Joe. And it also emphasizes the importance of individual choice. Even if we're surrounded by a terrible environment, we still have a decision to make. That doesn't mean our hand's been forced. It's just we've been dealt a disadvantage, if that's the case. Good, Joe. And hopefully so, we're picking up on that. And there may be some of us, we might not have kids. We might not have grandchildren. Or maybe we do, and they're already gone. But we can still serve in that role for countless children of God in this place and in our communities. And who knows the difference that can make, as it certainly made in Asa's life. Great, Joe. Thank you. Okay, so as we're moving on here, Asa did what's right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. There is a biological connection here, but this may be a greater significance, the father of faith. that he has, his ancestor David. Verse 12, here are the positive things that he does. He banished here's that term again in the New King James, the phrase, the perverted persons. You have sodomites, many of you there. Maybe some of you have, is really what it is, a male cult or temple prostitute. And it could be from improper heterosexual relationships. I think a lot of this probably has to do with homosexuality. But anyway, whatever it is, the sexual sins, he addresses those, he takes care of those, and he removes all the idols that his father had made. Verse 13, he's not afraid to rock the boat in the family. He also removed Ma'akah, his grandmother, from being Queen Mother. That's an interesting title. Queen Mother. Does that mean she's in charge? Is she the Elizabeth I of yesteryears? Who is this? Good, Autumn. That's basically what it is. It's just a mother to the king is really, it's almost like an honorary title. This doesn't carry all this legal power. Who's ruling the nation right now? It's not the queen mother. It is the grandson, Asa, the male. He's the king, and he's ruling the country. So yeah, this is kind of an honorary title, queen mother, but he removes her. He strips her of her dignity as far as this label goes, because she had made an obscene image. And I think that's interesting, that translation. An obscene image of Asherah. And Asa cut down her obscene image and burned it by the brook Kidron. Okay, so just a little bit of information here. Asherah is the Canaanite goddess of fortune and happiness. And so basically, she looks to this fake entity as the source of all blessing. It's kind of her lucky statue, okay, right here. And it infuriates her grandson, Asa. And he has it cut down, and it's burned, the remnants of it. We don't trust in foreign gods. I don't care if you're in my family. It's not happening. In fact, you may still be in my family, but you're not a part of the royal family, essentially, any longer. You're not recognized as that. Wow. So as far as obscene image goes, the meaning of this Hebrew term is horrid or horrible thing. Horrid or horrible thing. And I say it's a little bit intriguing because if it's properly translated in the idea of it being obscene, you know, it could be when it's talking about cleaning up all the sexual promiscuity that's going on in the area. And then there's this statue of a goddess, meaning a female. It could be that the statue itself was obscene or sexual, suggestive. And that may be what offended him so greatly as he's trying to clean up all of these things. But regardless, he takes care of this matter, and it doesn't even matter if it's his own family. What lessons do we take from this? Does Jesus have anything to say along these lines about addressing things that are off, that need to be corrected? And what about if it's within our own family, though? That kind of complicates things, doesn't it? Do we bend the rules a little bit there? Matthew 10, 34 through 37, do not think that I came to bring peace. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. You say, well, I love my mom, I love my kid. Well, that's good, you should. But he goes on to say, he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. My relationship with you comes first. Asa gets that. Unfortunately, probably not from the dad or even the granddad that he had, but he gets it from a solid spiritual influence in the kingdom of God. And so he fixes these issues, even the ones that are going on in his own family. Verse 14, this is kind of interesting also. But not everything's just like ideal in every way under his reign. The high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was loyal to the Lord all his days. I ask you to turn over to 2 Chronicles now again, if you will. 2 Chronicles. This time we're going to fast forward a little bit to chapter 15 because I want to address something that sounds like a contradiction in these teachings and these harmonies. 2 Chronicles 15, and we'll read verses 17 and 18. This is under Asa's reign, the parallel to where we are. But the high places were not taken out of Israel, as we read in 1 Kings. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true all his days. And he brought into the house of God the sacred gifts of his father, and his own sacred gifts, silver and gold and vessels. But now in this same spot, 2 Chronicles, I ask you to look back. You might not even need to turn to chapter 14, and we're going to read a statement that sounds like it contradicts. 2 Chronicles 14, verses 3 and 4. Speaking of Asa, he took away the foreign altars and the high places, and broke down the pillars, and cut down the Asherim, and commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to keep the law and the commandment. Okay, so did you catch that? 1 Kings 15, 2 Chronicles 15, we read the high places were not taken out of Israel. Back in chapter 14 of 2 Chronicles, he took away the foreign altars and the high places. That's completely the opposite of what we read in those places. So have we finally done it? All this effort for decades, and as far as people go, for centuries and millennia, we found it, the first true Bible contradiction. What do you see about the contexts of these two? Okay, very, very good, Paul. So this may be the reference. There is actually a difference. I'm like you, I picked up on that. It's Judah in chapter 14. It's Israel in chapter 15. Why might he not have messed with high places in Israel? He's not the king over there. He doesn't have any jurisdiction in that place. Could be one thing, although it gets a little confusing because sometimes Judah and Israel are used interchangeably for the territory of God's people. So very good, Paul. That's an astute observation. That's one possibility. But a second one is this, and I think this may be more so what it is, that the context in chapter 14, where he takes away all this stuff, notice he took away the foreign altars, and I believe it's the New King James that reads the altars of pagan gods or something along this, and the high places. I think could be the reference to he takes away all of the high places that are being used to worship foreign gods. But perhaps in chapter 15, whenever his heart remains true to the Lord and to his worship of God, he doesn't take away the high places and all these different territories that are being used to worship God. But he does not tolerate the worship of pagan gods. So that's a possibility also. But I'm like you, Paul. I did notice the difference in those two words. And that may be what it is. He can't do anything about what's going on in the north, but he can in the south, and he takes care of that. Or it could be that he doesn't tolerate high places being used for the worship of any false god. However, he does continue to tolerate the high places being used for the worship of the true God. Now, as small as a matter that might seem, like, why would it matter, though, that ideally the high places aren't even going to be used to worship the true God? Why would that be the case? By this point, the temple has been built. And we have record of God's commandments that the worship of the Lord is to take place, sacrifices and offerings in one location, and that's in Jerusalem. And that's when everything's being done absolutely perfectly. And Roy, to go back to what it is that you asked, I think this is stated, this is less than ideal, what's going on here with Asa, but God appreciates the heart that he has for him, and the overall tenor of his life is to do the right thing, and comparatively to all the wrong things that have been done through the years, this is a very, very small matter, and he's led this great reform to bring the people of God back. So let's read verse 15 of our text, 1 Kings 15, and then we'll cross over and point out a few highlights in 2 Chronicles as we close. Yes, sir, Joe? I see in verse 1, Asa, his son. Okay, is that the one you're talking about? Okay, so we have, sorry. Okay. Gotcha. Okay, no, that's fine. No problem. Thank you. Okay, any others before we conclude with verse 15? Turn over and read just a few things quickly in 2 Chronicles. Verse 15 of 1 Kings 15. He also brought into the house of the Lord the things which his father had dedicated. And remember, there's some good things that went on, especially for 3 years under Rehoboam's reign. And the things which he himself had dedicated, silver and gold and utensils. Okay, so now I want to go back to 2 Chronicles 14, and I know we've done this quite a bit, but this is the last time, okay? 2 Chronicles 14, and we're going to point out just a few things that we're told. Further detail we don't find in the Kings, and we see this a lot. The rest of the acts of so-and-so, we read it earlier, they're not found in the books of the Chronicles, and so let's look over there, and let's read a few of these from 2 Chronicles 14 about King Asa. Verse 2 of chapter 14, 2 Chronicles. Asa did what was good and right in the eyes of the Lord his God. And I wish we had the time, we don't, but to go through and to read how many times they had rest and peace and all these positive, but especially for the land, rest and peace, a lack of oppression. I counted at least about 7 times through this stretch compared to all the war and the conflict which takes place prior. And notice though in verse 7, when Asa states this fact to Judah, he says, "Let us build these cities, make walls around them, towers, gates, bars, while the land is yet before us, because," it's not an accident, it's not coincidence, "we have sought the Lord our God. We have sought him, and he has given us rest on every side." So they built and they prospered. Remember what's gone on back in the time of Solomon? Everything's gold. Everything's gold. Silver, we don't use silver around here. The second most valuable metal resource in the world was considered as trash, stones. The people were so rich. And then you go down just one generation, and Rehoboam, and they can barely scrape by to afford bronze. For a lot of their things, the third most valuable metal. That's how much the economy has fallen off. But under this guy's reign, 41 years, they're prospering. And things are valuable. The economy's gone up again. Verse 8, "And Asa had an army of 300,000 from Judah, who carried shields and spears, and from Benjamin, 280,000. Even this tribe is repopulated from the terrible things that took place during the period of the judges and the atrocities. So you had 300,000 plus 280,000, that's almost 600,000 soldiers. Huge army. Who carried shields and drew bows. All of these were mighty men of valor. Then Zerah, the Ethiopian, things changed, or they could, came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men. Judah's in trouble. They have a big army, but they don't have 1,000,000 soldiers. They're outnumbered about 2 to 1 here. And 300 chariots, and he came to Mareshah. And I'm going to show you a map here as we bring things together. Mareshah is in the bottom left-ish portion of the screen. You see Mareshah. So if you go straight out to the right, you'll find that. And this traveling is done a couple hundred miles down from the southwest. The Ethiopians at least, if not more like 300. And so Asa goes out against them. They set troops in battle array in the valley of Zephathah at Mareshah. And you can tell that's just maybe a few miles, maybe about 5 at the most, 10 to the north, the valley of Zephathah. And battle's going to take place here. Now, one of the great prayers of Scripture, listen to this in verse 11. "And Asa cried out to the Lord his God and said, Lord, it is nothing for you to help, whether with many or with those who have no power. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rest on you. And in your name we go against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Do not let man prevail against you." They have no chance in this battle, outnumbered the way they are, or so it would be perceived. And so he prays to God, perhaps even before the entire nation, and lets it be known, you are our God, you have been, you always will be, we remain on you. Nobody can stand against you. We're going out here to fight in your name. Now that's faith. And don't you know that's to generate confidence in the hearts of his soldiers. So the Lord, verse 12, struck the Ethiopians before Asa and Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. And Asa and the people who were with him pursued them to Gerar. That's about 75 miles down to the southwest. So the Ethiopians were overthrown. They could not recover, for they were broken before the Lord and his army. And they carried away very much spoil. Then they defeated all the cities around Gerar. They just go on a rampage now. For the fear of the Lord came upon them, and they plundered all the cities, for there was exceedingly much spoil in them. They also attacked the livestock enclosures and carried off sheep and camels in abundance. And then they returned. They returned then to the capital city of Jerusalem. You go into chapter 15 and you're reminded of these sweeping reforms that take place throughout the nation. We'll just read one verse here, 15. And all Judah rejoiced at this reconfirmation of God's oath with his people and his people with him, for they had sworn with all their heart and sought him with all their soul. And he was found by them. And yet again we're told, the Lord gave them rest all around. Verse 18, he also brought into the house of God the things that his father had dedicated and that he himself had dedicated, silver and gold and utensils. Throughout the reign of Asa, there's consistency in what he gives to God. And whenever they win these battles, the Lord is the one who receives the first. You read about 700 animals and 7,000 animals being offered to God from all the blessing that he's provided the people. But as always, what God turns around and gives back to his people is so much more than they ever even thought about giving to him. It's the eternal principle at work. You can't outgive God. Economically, they can't outgive God, but it goes much deeper than that. They're giving so much to the Lord economically, but more importantly, they're giving their hearts and their lives to him. And God turns around and gives them peace. And yes, physical blessing, but so much more, a peace and a spiritual blessing of what they know they have, not just for a few years, but forever. That takes us through verse 15 of 1 Kings 15, our main text. And then we'll pick up with some real turmoil that goes on after the reign of this wonderful king of Israel for 41 years, Asa. But any other comments that we've had other than what's been brought out? Any questions about the text that we've covered this morning? Okay, we're going to close with that. Please, if you will, read the remainder of chapter 15, all that's left of chapter 15. We're going to cross over and read the first 7 verses and cover next time also in chapter 16. So from 1 Kings 15, 16 through chapter 16, verse 7. Memory verse will be from chapter 16. Memory verse is 16:3. 16:3. Memory work. Okay, thank you. Look forward to that together.